the F.E. McWilliam's gallery on the last leg of our 5-day tour, courtesy of the Northern Ireland Museums Council, looking at climate change with a variety of different fascinating panellists and lots of different topics. We've talked about politics, we've talked about ecosystems, we've talked about land use, we've talked about farming, we've talked about the built environment, and I think tonight we can include elements of all of these, but we can also, if we focus on one thing in particular, let's look at the future. Now, I'm going to ask each of you in turn to introduce yourselves and just give us a few minutes on who you are and what your take is on these issues. And I might as well start over there with you, Scott.
Excellent. Evening. My name is Scott Howes. I work for an organisation called Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful. We are an environmental charity based in Northern Ireland, working with individuals, community groups, businesses across a range of sectors, including schools, youth groups, community leaders, community groups and businesses, to focus on creating a cleaner and greener Northern Ireland, really, with a positive future focused around the environment. We work across a variety of themes. Those include biodiversity recovery, which is a growing part of what we do, working to increase the amount of protecting nature and enhancing what we have in Northern Ireland in terms of wildflowers and trees. And we do that with schools and other organisations. The other themes include waste and pollution solutions. So how can we begin to think again about how we tackle the issue of waste and manage what we see as waste, whether that is single-use plastics, whether that's how we think about fashion and the fast fashion issues and the pollution that comes with that. How can we change how we manage that? Environmental education is a significant theme for the organisation. So we are the national operators for the Eco Schools programme that is offered by the Foundation for Environmental Education. We run that in all schools in Northern Ireland, so there's a lot of education work and input there to support teachers and pupils and students across the key stages. And lastly, climate action. So it's a newer part of the organisation. We are funded by DERA to develop programmes that broaden the climate change conversation and include a wider number of groups that instill some confidence and awareness and knowledge, but enable people to begin to form opinion, see what part they play, and most significantly feel more confident about it and start to take action. So a whole range of things that come together to focus on protecting the environment, but significantly developing that idea of a positive future by people being involved, people being inspired, networked, and coming together to make a difference. So broadly, that's what we do.
Amazing, thank you. Dakota.
Yeah, my name is Dakota Reid and I work for RSPB Northern Ireland. I'm a conservation officer and I work within the policy team. I'm effectively a professional nature nerd, I suppose. I consider nature nerd to be a positive thing, but I really live and breathe nature. You know, even when outside of work, I'm often out and about recording birds and insects and marine life. I'm also part of the 30 Under 30 programme, which is coordinated by Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful, and I think part of what sort of unites us in that is that all generations are feeling this sort of sense of fear about the environmental crises that we're facing, but our generation is the first generation to possibly feel that we are growing up actually really in the middle of the climate catastrophe. And to make it clear, the climate crisis, the nature crisis, these are not things that are happening in the future. This is something that is very much here and real now. And I think that sort of sense of being this first generation growing up in that unites us, but also that we are sort of the last generation who can actually do something about it. And we can do something about it, and we can. We do still have time to act, but we really are fast running out of time. You know, we are very much facing this situation of these tipping points that we could hit. This is a make or break decade, because if we don't do something to avoid these tipping points, we have what is known as runaway climate change, and that's where we're really starting to get into, well, it already is, as the IPCC has said, code red for humanity, but then it's a whole different world of trouble. But you know, while it's very important for me and for the organisation I'm part of to shout about the science and call out decision makers whenever they're not doing what they should be doing to really treat this like the crisis that it is. For me, it's also very important, and I know this is something we're going to touch upon tonight, to sort of present what a vision for a sustainable future could look like. Because a sustainable future is still within our grasp, and for me, that is about avoiding, the climate breakdown and the impacts that's going to have, the injustices for our fellow human beings. It's about realising this future where active travel and public transport are realities as the norm, and there's so many social reasons why we should want that, but there's so many environmental reasons for why we can't afford not to be going in that direction. But for me, a lot of it comes back down to, because my focus is really addressing this nature crisis, this biodiversity crisis, it comes back to, what can we do, and this is a large part of my work, to get to a nature positive Northern Ireland, which is this concept of it's not just stopping the decline of nature, but it's actually restoring nature back to where it should be. And, as I'm a 23-year-old, I can't actually comprehend how much we have lost, because it's this concept called shifting baseline syndrome, where I cannot comprehend in my lifetime, what it was like before the UK lost 97% of its wildflower meadows, before so many species declined in abundance to such significant extents. And for me, it's about painting this vision, this picture of a future where we get back a lot of what we have lost, and it is within our grasp that future generations, if I had kids, my future kids would be living in a much more nature-rich Northern Ireland. We're in the middle of a sixth mass extinction, the first mass extinction to be caused by humans. We need to be acting on this as a matter of urgency, and it's not an issue that is happening in far-flung corners of the world. It's not, just deforestation in the Amazon or the bleaching of tropical coral reefs. This is something that is very close to home. Northern Ireland is the 12th worst country for biodiversity loss out of 240. It is that shocking. But for me, what motivates me is, and what I sort of work towards in my day-to-day role, is this future where our uplands are once again rich in the sound of breeding curlew, and hen harriers are as abundant as they should be and not persecuted, where our peatlands are re-wetted and they're sequestering carbon, they're providing valuable recreational spaces, they're delivering on those ecosystem services like preventing flooding and providing homes for important wildlife such as marsh fritillaries and Irish damselflies. And where our coasts are abundant in breeding seabirds, puffins are no longer threatened with extinction, which is partly because of the climate crisis. Roseate terns, the rarest breeding seabird in Western Europe, we don't just have one pair in Northern Ireland, we have hundreds. And this idea of a farmland could, it would be the norm on a family farm that you would have breeding lapwing, breeding barn owls and yellowhammers once again. And the farmers are supported in, farming in that way that is friendly for nature. So that's what motivates me, that is what I do in my day-to-day role and outside of work as well, is sort of fighting for that future where that sustainable vision is realised, because it is a statement of fact. Nature is in crisis, but it is also true that together we can save it.
Nice, thank you. John.
Can we please elect Dakota to be our Minister for the Environment? Fantastic. My name is John Barry. I'm a father of two. And that's quite important to me for people to understand where I'm coming from in my academic activism. I'm Professor of Green Political Economy at Queen's University Belfast. I also co-chair the Belfast Climate Commission, and I'm a recovering politician. I was for 7 years a local government councillor for the Green Party. So I come with a sense that the future, when I was a young cub as an academic many moons ago, the future was a sense of abstract future generations. But when you have children, the future now has names. And I am very scared for my children's future. As somebody who's not a climate scientist, I'm a social scientist, I'm a heterodox post-growth economist, which we may get into. But I do read the climate science, and we're going completely in the wrong direction. 1.5 in my view is gone. I think we need to be honest with people to say that that is not going to happen in terms of keeping global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees. I've had to take the extraordinary act or process in the last number of years of putting trigger warnings on my modules at the university. Because while I'm a very happy, energetic and enthusiastic person and I'm not depressed, I think I may be a carrier because of the knowledge I was imparting to my students about understanding the impact it was having on them. There are high levels of climate anxiety amongst young people, and what's adding to that anxiety is the lack of government action, and that's what makes me angry. That we have all the technologies we need, we have all the solutions there. It will mean radical transformations, as the IPCC and other reports have said, in all sectors of our lives in the future. So the vision of the future is not the same as we have now with knobs on. There's no app for what we're now entering in terms of transformation. And a particular area of concern for me, which we may get into discussing, that is very pertinent to views of the future. One is the lack of imagination and creativity, and we are going to have to integrate the imaginative. Therefore, it's very fitting that we're here in the F.E. McWilliam's gallery, surrounded by beautiful art and so on. So I do think we need to integrate culture, if you like, as the fourth leg of the social, economic and environmental aspects of understanding sustainability. And there's an absolute paucity of imagination, creativity and disruptive thinking, even within the academy, certainly amongst policymakers. The dominant narrative we get, which is the second issue I want to get on to in terms of the future, is that there is a dominant narrative of graining business as usual, that we can somehow technologically decouple an ever-growing society, ever-increasing consumption, hypermobility, flying in products all over the world, as we're now witnessing, the problems of globalised supply chains in terms of disruption to certain forms of fruit and vegetables in the UK and Ireland. And so therefore I think in terms of the future orientation of the transformations we are now going to enter, we need to replace optimism with hope. What do I mean by that? There is a lot in the media, in the policy world and politics of what I would say is a techno-optimistic view that we will come up with whiz-bang technologies, whether it's direct air capture at scale, carbon capture and sequestration, solar radiation management at a planetary scale, that these things will enable us to continue business as usual. And the problem with optimism is that in this case there's no empirical evidence that we can decouple an ever-growing economy in terms of pollution, resources, energy, and stay within the planetary boundaries. So it's empirically impossible. It's mythic thinking in my view. But the other aspect that optimism has is that it's passive. We don't have to do anything. Elon has it covered. The government is going to save us. God forbid academics like me are going to come along and save us. In other words, there's an outsourcing of agency with a sense of optimism. Hope is very different. Hope is active. Hope requires us to do two things. One is to countenance the possibility of failure. Optimism, it's the equivalent of what we say in Ireland as it'll be grand. That somehow there's this sense that things are going to work out okay. I think that's lazy, suboptimal, risky, and doesn't serve the future very well. We need active hope in terms of being involved in whether it's political activism, whether it's lobbying politicians, whether it's supporting brilliant young people like Dakota. But it is about countenancing a very different way of life in the future. And that's why I would caution against a happy-clappy, naive techno-optimism, and that we're actually going to need technological innovation. We will not get to sustainability, climate resilience, nature-friendly forms of life if we rely on technology alone. So therefore we need to engage in much more transformative aspects of what we need in the future, and that's where, as I say, hope is needed rather than optimism. But lots and lots of creativity and imagination as well.
Gosh, well, thank you to all three. There's a lot to unpack there. And I might actually just kind of continue some of the thoughts that you were just sharing there. I mean, I'm really interested that you've been an academic and a politician, unusual combination. I mean, most academics, particularly those who are critical of growth and from the sort of perspectives you were saying, quite ivory-towered, it seems to me. And I would often say to them, as somebody who has a different perspective on this, go out there and sell your anti-growth to the general public. Get yourself elected, and we'll see how far that takes you in democratic polity. And actually, you've been out there, you've done that, and presumably you've talked to people on the doorstep about these issues. And what kinds of insights did you gain from actually speaking to real people?
Well, what we need is a working class environmentalism. I mean, too often the environmental green movement is seen as a woke, educated, guilty urban middle class phenomenon.
White as well.
And incredibly white and often dominated by people like you and me with beards and white skin and so on. So it's hard to talk about the end of the world when people can't talk about the end of the week. And certainly my experience as a politician brought up close and personal the importance of people having to have a benefit in this transition. Where's the green job? So this idea of the just transition, I think that's the policy term. I think people get jobs. They get things like security. And certainly we can square everything I've said in terms of moving beyond growth by engaging in something that we haven't done in quite some time. It's a class issue. The richest, the top 10% in terms of wealth, are the ones who are disproportionately responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions. So while we need to move to a post-growth society at a macro level, that does not mean that within an economy that isn't growing, bits of it are increasing and decreasing and so on. People misunderstand the kind of degrowth, post-growth perspectives. It means everything collapsing in the economy. It's not that at all. Yeah, it's about staying within planetary boundaries, but also ensuring nobody falls below a social floor. So for me, just to finish and go back to where I started, we absolutely need to introduce a working class, majoritarian perspective into this debate, whereby ordinary working class people in the cost of living crisis, to connect that to the war in Ukraine and the climate crisis. But for me, certainly as a politician, what I found, what landed with a lot of people was talking about state provision of services, security, of sharing, of making sure there's decent public services. So for me, there is an alignment between attending to the climate crisis by addressing socioeconomic inequality, because inequality itself is a major driver of overconsumption and unsustainability. We simply can't afford the rich. And to turn the issue around, we don't have a poverty problem, we have a wealth problem. So we need to tackle that issue. That therefore, I think, creates the space politically for working class people in particular, those on the bottom income level, to say, oh, there's something in this for me. Because if you impose a carbon tax, a flat carbon tax on people, as we've seen in France, ordinary working class people are saying, well, why am I paying for the malfeasance ecologically of rich people, and therefore we have the Gilets jaunes movement. So I just think pragmatically, to get people to buy into democratically, as you said, we need to include them in the conversation and actually provide them with the reasons why this transition is going to mean a better life. Because the reality is nobody ever rises with austerity in history. We should be presenting a green, transformative, nature-friendly future, not as some begrudging, science-driven, technocratic, top-down form of transition that we have to do in an emergency. It is about saying that the society we want to portray to people, go back to something Dakota said, and I speak now as a completely collapsed Catholic, not even as a lapsed Catholic, but the Bible has some good positions on this. Without vision, the people perish, the good book says. So what is the vision we should be presenting to our people of a green, transformative, low-carbon economy? It should be like getting a postcard from a fantastic holiday destination. Whereas I think the green movement, of which I'm a member, has been too often like the teetotaler at the party. Don't be drinking, don't be flying, don't be getting too much red meat. That's not going to win anybody over. So we have to present a resolutely positive vision of the future, but it does require, in my view, political action. It does require transformative action, and indeed I would go so far to say it's revolutionary forms of transformations that we are going to see in the future.
I'm pleased to hear you mention planetary boundaries on 2 occasions, I think. I wrote a book on this in 2011, and I just found the whole idea, the whole concept so useful, because otherwise we tend to have this singular focus on climate and carbon. And we tend to, planetary boundaries, that's just one.
Yeah.
You've got nitrogen, you've got biodiversity, you've got land use, you've got ozone, you've got the sort of pollutants, the general toxic pollutants as well, all of which affect each other. And we've talked a lot in previous evenings about the biodiversity impacts of agriculture. And of course, there's so many different dimensions to this. I noticed the murmuration on Albert Bridge in Belfast you were talking about on social media having disappeared probably because of light pollution. It's not a climate impact, but it's again part of the general anthropogenic impact on the natural world, which is so multi-dimensional. But just wondering if you could talk a bit, Dakota, about your own work, because you've spent a lot of time in nature, immersed in nature, recording it, bird watching, looking at insects. I mean, your photos are incredible. I would advise anyone to have a look at some of your work, because it's just sensational in terms of just how visually rewarding it is to see these amazing species. What keeps you going? What's your kind of postcard for the future, to use John's term?
Well, it's this idea of nature being restored to the levels that it was once at, and it keeps me sane, getting out and seeing nature. And even though it's very hard for me to sort of decouple that idea of how much should be here, and how much has been lost, and looking at species that I adore and love to photograph and see, but knowing that actually they're red listed or they're amber listed or they have declined by whatever percent. I love going out and photographing curlew. Curlew could be extinct as a breeding bird in Ireland within the next 10 years, and without focused conservation work like my own organisation are doing, Birdwatch Ireland are doing, we would probably be very close to that point right now. And I think it's difficult. Time spent in nature for me is very sort of restorative and healing, but also you can't get away from this idea of nature is in decline, and you can see that everywhere. And I suppose I love that idea of like a postcard from the future, that it's something to look forward to. It's a destination that we should all want to get to. It's not sort of that idea of being punished, but something, not a hopeful future that is worth fighting for. And I think for me that a big part of that is going to be people having a greater connection to nature. That people, because I think it's shocking that there's not more environmental education in schools. I know Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful are doing work on this. I feel so lucky that my mum took me to places where I could go and see nature reserves and the like. But not everyone has that opportunity. They're difficult to get to. If you come from a low-income background, if you don't have a car, how are you meant to get to these places and everything? It needs to be embedded in the education system that everyone gets this access. The green spaces, the sustainable future that we're fighting for. There are green spaces everywhere that are high-quality, biodiverse, safe, that people can access, and they can see, these beautiful experiences that I have had of seeing nature, photographing nature, spending time in nature. But that's something that everyone gets growing up. That is what, that would be a large part of my vision for the future. And we're not, at the moment, we're not really moving in a great direction. Something like the starlings on Albert Bridge, that was something that was in the city centre that a lot of people who didn't necessarily get time in nature were able to watch this absolutely incredible natural spectacle. And to lose something like that is very, it is a real shame. And obviously we hope that, in the future nature is a bigger part of decision making, and that it shouldn't be siloed, that it's just, in the Department for Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs should be looking at these matters of biodiversity and nature and green access to green spaces. This should be something that's looked at right across decision making, because it's so integral. We are part of nature. We're not a part of it. Apart from it, we cannot survive without it, and we should want to. It brings me and others so much joy to spend time in nature. It's been proven the benefits for mental health, physical health, and everything. This should be something that everyone should have access to. And what you said about this sort of idea of it's not just broadening out the conversation beyond climate and sort of talking about carbon and emissions, and also bringing pollution and biodiversity loss and all the aspects of what we're doing to this planet. And that's a sort of a big part of my day-to-day thinking is, broadening out this conversation to have, a very broad conversation about everything that we're doing to the environment and what sort of change we need to see about this, because, climate is obviously a very large part of the conversation, and it's good that we're seeing a lot more focus on climate, but we need to also see focus on nature loss, which is, my main focus, because that's, the IPCC has said themselves, we cannot you cannot disentangle biodiversity loss and the climate crisis. The two things need to be addressed together, and we know they can. We know what it looks like when governments do treat something like a crisis. We saw that with COVID. We know that we can have action when we are treating it like the emergency that it is, and that that future is within grasp, where it's nature rich. It's we're not suffering the effects of the climate crisis, and those injustices of people being forced out of their homes because of the climate crisis. That future for me, it is within grasp, and it is something that is definitely worth fighting for.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't agree more. Scott, I'm a little bit triggered by the idea of keep Northern Ireland beautiful, because this is a province of huge roads. Declining nature, what did you say was among the 12th?
The 12th worst in the world.
12th worst in the world, degraded peatlands, intensive farming, huge amounts of nitrogen runoff into rivers, a coastline and an offshore environment which is similarly despoiled, and with a political system which is so completely dysfunctional that there seems to be no prospect of actually dealing with any of these things. So, the reason why I think it's a nice optimistic idea to say keep it beautiful, but people look at, I'm from the Welsh borders, that's where I'm living at the moment. People look at the Brecon Beacons, which is our local national park, and say you've got these beautiful green hills and covered in sheep, but ecologically it's a wasteland. There's nothing there at all. There's no insects, there's no birds. So beauty isn't the same as ecology. It isn't the same as sustainability. How do you
No, absolutely. It's a name, and it's a starting point, and it's an entry point really to a lot of what we do. Beauty isn't the only thing, of course. It's the quality and the sort of operation of all these systems, natural systems, that are vital and important. I think one of the key things, though, when you start moving into some of the areas that we work in, to go back to some of the things that both John and Dakota were saying, when we do training with and talk to individuals, as Dakota was saying, education is vital, and working and talking to people and bringing them into the conversation is vital, not only in schools and young people to deepen their understanding of their surroundings in this beautiful part of the world. There's some amazing work going on in schools, but there's also a lack of confidence in teachers to pick up this topic, this difficult topic to have, and to teach young people about it. And all the studies we've done about on the Eco Schools programme, the climate action theme is one of the least accessed modules within that. So there's a nervousness about looking at it. So part of making it deeper and more than keep Northern Ireland beautiful, what else is about sharing information with people. So we do that with teachers to encourage them to understand what's going on and then be able to talk to their students about it. But we also do that with community groups, sort of to bring them into the conversation. And this connects to what John was saying, really, because one of the most significant things is that in terms of our futures, which is the topic we're on tonight really, is about bringing more people, individuals and communities into that conversation and giving them the information they need to start making decisions, empowering them to have a voice and to have an opinion, to take action locally and to start getting involved. And that's where real change is going to come from. It can't just be a top-down approach. It's important the government takes action. It's important that we call for more. We need to act deeper and faster. And government is stalled at the moment here, and that needs to change for this crisis. But deep change needs to come from communities upwards. And part of our role that is beyond that phrase, keep Northern Ireland beautiful, is to empower people to have enough information to know what they can do. We facilitate community climate action plans so people become aware of the challenge. One of the things that often gets said to us on our training is, why aren't we being told about this? Still, we assume that we all talk about the climate crisis in the news all the time, but there's this veneer of awareness, I think. And it needs to go much deeper. I think whilst we know young people are nervous and anxious about it, and we provide a lot of programs around that to schools. We've got a new one going into schools soon that is about developing awareness around climate change at Key Stage 2, and that's aligned to the NHS wellbeing values. So it is about sort of bringing it to young people in a way that is more palatable, that they can embed into the system because they're going to grow up with this, but takes them again to action, to a sense of how they can be involved, how they can be part of the change. So that's true across schools and across communities, and I think we need to push deep into that, to mobilise people, quite honestly, to mobilise feeling, to mobilise a connection to this issue, to enable people to see the depths of the challenge that we're in, and instill a sense of what is possible. Storytelling, possibility of action, involvement, bringing in art and culture, as we've discussed a little bit here as well, to convey the story. But part of it is talking about that postcard from the future. Some of the training we deliver starts that process and says to people, if you woke up tomorrow morning and you were in a net zero world, how would you know? What would be different? What would be the first thing when you looked out the window that told you you were in what you imagined to be a net zero world? Because we have to start imagining a future that is different and that challenges some of the norms that we have, because we're not moving quick enough. So we have to have those conversations great change comes from that imaginative process of thinking differently about our future. So those conversations are key.
Can I just
Yeah, do. And also, what are you saying? I want to know what your net zero world looks like. Because it sounds like it's politically very different.
Sure.
Yeah, it's not just a case of we're all driving electric cars and there's a big number of wind turbines, right? It's a transformed world in a different way as well. So if you can answer that and address that.
I just want to come back in terms of what Scott was saying, in terms of it's an old organising principle in politics of educate, agitate, organise. And in everything you said there, Scott, you begin with education, because I think there's a genuine ignorance out there of people, they don't know how bad it is. And I don't want to be always the Jeremiah, but go back to what I said earlier, 1.5 is dead. It's gone. We will not reach that 1.5 degree. And therefore we need to be honest with our communities about them. What does that mean? I really admire the work of Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful that I've had some involvement with, and also Friends of the Earth and others, about the importance of place protectors. It begins with a place that you love, but you're absolutely right, Mark, to focus purely on the aesthetic, the beautiful, the surface, when it's actually ecologically dead. It's the same as these terrible plantations we have across this island of Sitka spruce and fast-growing commercial trees. Look lovely, but they're dead. There's nothing in there. It's like Leilanda. You should be absolutely banned from our shores. But I do think that we have to take people where they're at, and you're absolutely right in terms of this will not be imposed from the top down. There's no one department, there's no one technology, there's no one discipline that's going to be able to give us the answers here. We are facing an unprecedented crisis, but also has a great opportunity in terms of what does that mean in terms of governance, for example. It seems to me that we will not have the future that we want, perhaps, and I think it's always good to imagine what is it like. You wake up and it's net zero 2050. Although we do have some issues with net zero. Sometimes it can be a get out of jail free card in terms of the moral hazard of not going for absolute zero, but there'll always be a residual element. I accept the importance of negative emissions technologies where we can actually do them at scale and they're cheap, or indeed nature-based solutions, re-wetting boglands and so on. But for me, I think we have to understand that the importance of economy and ecology coming together. The human metabolism with the natural world is expressed most explicitly in our economic system. The flow of energy, resources, pollution, whether it's lithium for cars, and although I drove down here in an electric car this evening, electric cars, folks, are not the future. Active travel, staying, working from home, hydrogen buses, we need an array. People trace the supply chains of lithium, cadmium, zinc. It's not a pretty story. So I think we need to be aware of some of those, again, naive technological, solutions. But I do think we're going to have to engage in what I call selective deglobalization. The pendulum has swung far too far, and the pandemic brought this out. Remember the great toilet roll famine at the start of the pandemic, where people were fighting each other in the supermarkets over toilet rolls? Wouldn't be the first thing I'd be fighting over now. There'd be other things like maybe the whiskey and pasta perhaps.
Avocados.
Or avocados now, the middle class favourite. Yeah. But there's something that we've gone too far in. Food insecurity is threatened by excessive globalisation and very just-in-time supply chains. Energy should be seen as an issue of security concern. So if there's two things that I think any nation society should have produced as locally as possible is food and energy. And to me that requires reducing this free trade mantra we've had for 30 years under neoliberalism. So we're going to have to start saying, how can we selectively de-globalise and relocalise our economy? Start seeing that, put your money where your house is. Start investing in local SMEs as opposed to large corporations. So the political vision for me is partly, as I say, an outworking of rewiring the economy-ecology relationship. And that to me means a more local world. It doesn't mean that we can't go on holidays, but maybe it's slow travel. It isn't this excessive rapidity and speed that we have almost enforced upon us in the modern world. So I do think relocalisation, and once you start relocalising the economy, not to the extent that it's autarky, and I'm not proposing North Korea, folks, where there's no trade in the rest of the world, but it should be fair trade, not free trade. And I think when you start having that selective deglobalised vision, I think that opens up the possibility there for greater opportunities for democratisation. Things like community wealth building, municipal and local council actually delivering on being connected to their local communities. So it is quite a very different vision than what we've experienced over the last 30 years. But it's still within living memory. I mean, we can speak to older generations who remember a time before this globalised, egocidal, growth-orientated system. And I'm not being rose-tinted by going back to the past. This is not about resilience as bouncing back. It's about resilience as transforming forward. But I do think the future is local. It's selectively deglobalised. It opens up a much more important opportunity for more citizen involvement in governance, because the problem is when you get bigger, as Schumacher says, small is beautiful. That opens up the possibility of more democratic forms of decision-making being possible. So there is a danger, of course, you go too local, because then how do we deal with folk in Africa and so on? So it is about saying that while we shouldn't forget about our global relations and responsibilities, it is also about trying to retool and refigure what does the local vision look like, because I'll just finish on this. I think the sustainable future we're talking about will be different in Bangalore, Bangor, Beijing, Boston, Berlin, I'm running out of bees. That there will not be one size fits all here, and therefore we do need to have these local experiments and new ways of living, including and crowdsourcing our local communities in that, in the way that both Dakota and Scott have pointed out, because I often think the answers are in the room. We have a terrible problem here in Northern Ireland that farming and land use, to our shame, is a net producer of carbon. It's usually a net sequester of carbon. That's not our farmers' fault, because they've been responding to an economic system of production for export, dairy and beef. We're good at growing grass on this island. I think our solutions can be found in our farming community if they're given the space, the opportunity, and working with other stakeholders. So for me, that's where I take a lot of hope. I do not put hope necessarily in government always. I put hope in people. When they're sufficiently informed, they're educated. I think people should be a lot more angry that our futures are being stolen and we are going to inherit a much more degraded future. There should be an anger there, and that requires organisation. As Malcolm X once wisely said, we're not outnumbered, we're out-organised. We need to get ourselves organised on this issue, those of us who want to have a future that is, as Dakota said, worth fighting for.
You mentioned farming there, and I think that's something that we could talk about, Dakota, as well. I can't remember who said that the elephant in the room is the cow. I mean, that's particularly the case in Northern Ireland. I think probably the single most environmentally challenging issue here is livestock, and it's one which I've noticed over this last week is pretty untouchable. But people are very, either are farmers or very quick to jump to the defence of farmers, which is fine. I mean, that's understandable, except that it's probably the biggest driver across all the planetary boundaries of the ecological crisis that we're in, and livestock in particular. I mean, you mentioned about Ireland's good at growing grass and all of that, but actually Ireland used to be good at growing trees. The actual natural ecosystem here would be a kind of maritime temperate rainforest.
Yes.
There's not much of that left, and nor is anyone really talking about bringing it back or allowing any degree of natural regeneration of woodland. I mean, it's all about, you know, and even the ecologists talk about farmland adapted birds and insects and so on and so forth. So, can I ask you to reflect on that a bit? Is it all about just farmland adapted species, or is there some slightly wider future for more, and I use the term rewilding because it's something I'm an advocate of, but you know, a more wilder type ecosystem as well?
Well, farming's not my specific area of expertise within policy, but we do a lot of work with some fantastic nature-friendly farming, farmers who are practicing these nature-friendly techniques, and it's absolutely possible to have, you know, profitable agriculture with, you know, nature-based solutions on farms, and, you know, with space for nature. And we work with some genuinely inspiring people across Northern Ireland, you know, across all different types of habitats and with different challenges and everything, who are doing incredible work to bring species back from the brink. You know, our farmers who, the farmers that RSPB works with in County Down have done so much for farmland birds in recent years. You know, yellowhammer, for example, you know, red listed, you know, very, very much threatened with extinction, and only, you know, just in small pockets now in County Down. And we have worked with farmers who are doing so much to bring these species back from the brink. The same with tree sparrows, the same with barn owls. You know, so there are problems with, you know, in terms of policy, farmers need to just be supported, you know, because I do not support any sort of demonisation of farmers, because for so long the subsidies have incentivised the wrong sorts of practices in terms of, you know, making space for nature and sequestering carbon. And there's so many farmers right across Northern Ireland, they want to be doing, you know, practicing these practices that are working with the environment, not against it. They need the support to do that. There needs to be policy leadership there. But it's, you know, I am hopeful of the future there, and it is going to be a challenge. You know, agriculture represents about a third of our emissions in Northern Ireland, and it hasn't been going down over the last...
And there's a carve out for methane and the net zero targets, which is quite boggles the mind, I have to say. I mean, it's not like methane ceased to be a greenhouse gas because the politicians decided it was too difficult to deal with.
Thanks, Edwin Coontz and the Ulster Farmers Union.
Well, it's going to be a challenge. It's absolutely going to be a challenge. But you know, and there is there's space for you know, rewilding in these discussions, but you know, in a sort of a just way that works with the people who's, you know, who live on the land and everything and work the land. You know, rewilding is a little bit of a buzzword, and it means different things to different people. But you know, and a lot of the time, restoring habitats. It's not about, you know, some people misinterpret rewilding to sort of mean land abandonment. You know, if humans just get out of the picture, the problem will be solved, and that's not true. Many of our habitats here, you know, over the years, they're semi-natural habitats because of and this is a European phenomenon really, that a lot of our habitats are the way they are because of human involvement across centuries. You know, for example, grasslands, you know, our species-rich grasslands, if left alone, would in many places disappear. They would be scrubbed over by small woodlands, and you know, it's about having that mosaic of habitats, and that's going to involve, you know, a lot of people working the land, managing the land and everything, and it's about working with communities to sort of get those outcomes for nature, but to continue, you know, so that no one loses their livelihoods along the way. You know, there is that balance can be struck. You know, we can have farming and nature in harmony, you know, different land uses in harmony, and get to that point where, you know, as John said, it's quite shocking that land use and land use change, those sectors are currently net emitters and not carbon, you know, sequestering carbon, but emitting more than they sequester. But it is possible to get to the point where, you know, our land management practices are working for climate, working for nature, and working for people.
But we're going to have to reduce livestock. I'm sorry to come across as a militant vegan here. I mean, I've actually had difficulty maintaining a vegan diet in Belfast for 5 days. It's, you know, I think the dietary change actually is a pretty significant one in terms of what people's personal choices are. I mean, do you think that the number of livestock is going to have to reduce in Northern Ireland?
It's not my specific area of policy around this, so you know, I probably can't give as good an answer as some of my colleagues could. But you know, from a personal perspective, I'm a lifelong vegetarian, and you know, it is important to me from a climate perspective that sort of that I can reduce my own personal carbon emissions or emissions in general from by adopting a sort of a diet like that. But it's going to be difficult. It's going to be one of the biggest challenges in terms of transitioning to this future that we're all, you know, painting the picture of here. But you know, it's all about making sure that people aren't, you know, put out of jobs along the way, that people don't lose livelihoods along the way. I probably can't answer the question in specific terms as well as some of the other people who I work with could, but there's going to be change. I mean, change is obviously coming, and a lot of that's going to be down to if people want to make, you know, personal choices to cut down meat consumption, as some as I have. But you know, working with farmers on this journey is going to be important, because it's all about this idea of a just transition, and that's something we very much need to keep a focus on. You know, it's about working with communities and making sure people aren't left behind, especially the people who are, you know, in sectors at the moment that are going to experience the most change, and whether that's farming or energy, that people are getting the support to still have a livelihood and be reskilled where necessary. You know, that's going to be the case, for example, in so the energy sector, where there are going to be new job opportunities coming up, and you know, there's a lot of reason for hope in all of this, and that, you know, a just transition is, in my opinion, possible.
But the science is pretty clear, you're right. We cannot continue with the same level of livestock across the island. Greenhouse gas emissions in the north here are about 24% of our, it's the biggest sector. It's 42% in the Republic. So right across this island, we have a major challenge that we have to honestly address farmers. The livestock herd will have to decrease. But before they, you know, start panicking, we say, okay, well, what else can we do? We should be, you know, public goods for public services in terms of paying them to sequester carbon. There's lots of opportunities there, but I think we have to be honest. And it was, in my view, regrettable to say the least, that in our fairly, in my view, modest and milk and water climate change bill, which we finally got passed last year when it received royal assent, there was this derogation outside the scheme for methane, which of course is multiple times more damaging and shorter lived than carbon, as most of us know, but it is much more damaging. But that in a way is a harbinger of the challenges ahead. And actually, and I don't know if this came up in your conversations while you've been here in Northern Ireland, Mark, we're going to have to build in processes of conflict resolution. We have to honestly admit there will be winners and losers in this. And actually, we have a very imperfect peace process here in Northern Ireland. And I do think that there are lessons we can learn despite our dysfunctional government that's been collapsed more than it's been up. We ended a war here, a major conflict transformation process that is not finished yet, and I do think there are lessons for us to interject into this transition that we're talking about. Because some people will be rejected. We've got climate deniers, and then we've got climate people who delay, we've got people who have honestly held views about concerns about this transition. So I do think if there's one thing Northern Ireland can offer in terms of this transition, is that lessons we have from conflict transformation. And the reality is, you make peace with your enemy. You make peace with those that you disagree with. We have to, you know, really see that this win-win narrative that it's all going to be sweetness and light in this transition, it will not be. You know, the future is already here. It's unevenly distributed. That's the reality in terms of what we already see in terms of these transitions. So the livestock herd will have to decrease. We have no biophysical evidence that we can either keep the same level of livestock or increase it while reducing all the negative environmental externalities.
And there's no techno solution to methane emissions from livestock, as far as I know. I mean, you can techno-solution lots of things like electricity, but I don't think you can do the cow or the sheep or other ruminants. So, well, I mean, a lot of it comes from land use transformation as well. But look, we should wrap up now. But I do want to give you one last chance to come back in. But after that, we'll come back and we'll do a 2-minute postcards in the future, if you like.
We're just on that issue that 46% around methane has to be a starting point. The bills going through Stormont at the time were hard enough, and you can argue that they got walked down, but they had to come together because we had to have legislation. It's now in place, and there's no reason why, through the process of negotiation and conversation and conflict resolution, that those targets can't be built on. And that methane reduction target can't be changed, but it's in place and it can be built. It's a huge shift for agricultural structures for Northern Ireland, and I think there's a huge amount of genuine fear in farm communities around livestock numbers, and the stuff about just transition is very relevant there, and people's livelihoods, how they're going to be supported, and there's uncertainty. Now we've got climate action plans coming through from the government. Now we have a Climate Change Act in place in Northern Ireland. This year there's a climate action plan, will be up for consultation, and we will be told how these targets are going to be met. And then the conversation starts about how we get there, are we getting there, or what else? And that process begins. And sometimes we don't always land where we want to be to start with. And I think we have legislation now which needs to be pushed up, and everybody's feet held to the fire in that sense.
Well, thanks to all three of you. Just by way of wrapping things up, I've been on the climate beat for a longish time now. I think it's about 23 years, and I've been through episodes of pessimism and optimism, despair and apocalypticism and everything in between. And I think you're right to say that 1.5 isn't going to happen. I think we always knew that. I mean, the carbon budget for 1.5 was always completely politically unachievable, and even technologically unachievable. Having said that, my 6 Degrees book, which I published in 2007, is also not going to happen, at least the later chapters. The scenarios of increasing greenhouse gas emissions throughout the century now look quite unlikely. We're probably at peak oil now in terms of global consumption. We're probably also at peak coal, which is, if anything, more important still. We've got a long way to go in terms of decarbonising the entire global economy, for sure. But the very rapid and very extreme climate scenarios seem a lot less likely than they did when I started in my career. And that's something I think I can feel. I can't take any credit for it, but I think I can feel somewhat encouraged by it, at least, that it is possible to see some progress in this area. I'm not so sure about the biodiversity issue, having said that. I think, if anything, it's got significantly worse in a very short space of time. We've seen the loss of the world's coral reefs in a way with a rapidity which even I did not expect. When I do a lot of work in the Maldives, actually, with the government there, and you can snorkel on the coral reefs and it's just rubble. It's covered in algae, and there's really nothing left of the original sort of incredible ecosystem that was the tropical coral reef. And we can't bring that back in any kind of meaningful timescale. And the same's happening, of course, with rainforests for a variety of other reasons, and so on and so forth. But at least here, at least in our own patch, we should be able to do something. And even then, we have problems. You can't, your marsh fertility or your starlings or whatever it happens to be. There's always some other interest there. So, as you say, we're going to have a negotiation which actually puts these issues front and centre in a way which we've never really done before. So, I will stop there, and maybe in reverse order this time. So maybe John, if you can start, just give us your postcard from the future and leave us hopeful or miserable as you wish. It's up to you.
No, well, I mean, the future for me has to be post-carbon, post-growth, which means it's post-capitalism. But that's okay. Capitalism is just a name of our current economic system. It is now past its sell-by date. To use that infamous sketch from Monty Python, it's a dead parrot. It served us well. Let's move on. We have to move to a situation where ask ourselves the question, and I ask myself this every year in teaching young people. For them, it's easier for them to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. For me, the root cause of everything we're talking about here is an ecocidal, suboptimal and risky economic system that commoditizes and consumes nature. That is, at this stage, in what I would call cancerous growth, and that's what cancer is. It's growth beyond the threshold that's unhealthy, So while I'm a post-growth economist, growth to a point is good. It's not about saying everything to be anti-growth. I think we have to honestly recognise that we need a new economic paradigm. Indeed, it's a large issue. We need a new cultural renaissance in terms of, biophilia, connecting ourselves with nature again. I mean, I'm often struck by in conversations around the external nature crisis. It always returns to ourselves in terms of whether it's human nature or internal human social relations. So for me, we cannot fix the climate and ecological and the other issues without fixing our broken socioeconomic system. And I think there's an ill appreciation of that, certainly amongst policymakers, politicians, most citizens, the media. There's still this desperate attempt to green business as usual, as if we have some plug-and-play version of the future that we simply, what I call, biofuel the Hummer. So we just take out the bad coal, oil and gas and we stick in good, green, renewable energy. Well, maybe the Hummer's the problem. Maybe it's the structure of our inequality-producing society that isn't actually adding to human flourishing at this stage. Never mind the biophysical limits that it's now reached. So for me, the image of the future, I don't even know what it may look like, but I know it's going to be more more local, which doesn't degrade the importance of global connections in terms of culture, language, and so on, but certainly food and energy and indeed money, to get more economical, or in terms of economics, we should keep money as local as possible. And it is about, saving the whole by saving the parts, acting local, thinking globally, very old ideas within the green movement and so on, without being naive at the importance of technology, about connection, and indeed just seeing that we need to introduce in our vision of the future pleasure, desire, because too often the language we use to talk about this is very science-based, technocratic, it's sacrificial, it's about what we're sacrificing. My view is, what are we sacrificing now in terms of a 4-day, 3-day working week? That means that we have to restructure our economy, more free time, meaningful free time. But it does mean honestly saying to our communities, we cannot continue with the consumption, the hypermobility, the globalized food system, a red meat-based diet or dairy-based diet. These things mean that we are looking at the end of the world as we know it. But you know what? That's okay. It's not the end of the world. It's simply the end of the world as we know it. So for me, I'm interested and excited at this moment in human history because it is a unique moment that we're in as a species. What are the debates? What are the visions? Because I'm not saying that I have all the answers, but I'm certainly got some science to back up that capitalism has now run its course. Globalization has gone far too far. Certainly our use of carbon, which has been incredibly beneficial to human civilization. We shouldn't, in the same way, not demonising farmers. Let's not demonise oil workers and communities. Oil is an incredibly energy-rich, dense source of material that has transformed human societies. It's just now past the threshold where we have to move beyond it. Let's give capitalism, give growth, give carbon energy a good burial, or in Ireland a good wake, celebrate what they've achieved, and move on.
Thank you very much. Dakota.
Yeah, for me, this sort of postcard from the future, for me it's, nature has been restored, and this idea, and as you say, it's really frightening what we're facing with the biodiversity crisis right now, and it has only got much worse in recent years. We have small areas to be hopeful for. Corn creeks have returned to Rathlin. They were basically extinct and they are now back. I think we had 4 calling males over the summer. That's a reason for hope. Red kites were brought back from the brink, bitterns brought back from the brink. Loads of species have been brought back from the brink because of conservation action. So we know we can do it, but it's just so many more species have gone so much closer to the brink, and that's very frightening. And 11% of species in Ireland are threatened with extinction. But my vision for the future is that common species are kept common, rare species are brought back from the brink, abundance of nature is once again restored, because it's difficult to comprehend the actual collapse in abundance of insects, for example. Not getting into species level, but just it's that idea people talk about, sort of the windscreen splatter that you would have seen maybe 50 years ago or something. It's totally different now. Even 30 years ago, the change has been incredible because we've just seen this collapse in numbers of abundance of our wildlife. You know, so my vision for the future is where those species are brought back, habitats are restored and valued by people and used by people, that we have had this, you know, we have achieved this idea of a just transition where people are not left behind. This is a future that should be good and enjoyable for people, for communities. That's really at the heart of it for me. It does come back to people. You know, I am absolutely passionate about the smallest little insects and everything, but humans are at the heart of it, and, you know, having more and more diverse people sort of engaged with nature, that's part of what RSPB is working towards. This idea of everyone having access to nature, that, you know, our urban spaces are much, much greener than they currently are now, that it's just embedded in all of our decision making, in our planning, in our farming and everything, that nature is a part of all of that, and that it's not something that is isolated to fragmented nature reserves, but it's something that is very much a core of everyday life, that, you know, our beautiful, rich, native, mature habitats are just, you know, are found in towns and cities, in the countryside, across farmland, everywhere. It's about, you know, that we'll have these healthy nature corridors, that, you know, nature is once again restored and resilient, that people are thriving because of it and realising the, you know, the benefits of that connection with nature, and that, you know, we're not facing a climate catastrophe anymore, and all of the threats to both people and nature that involves, that, you know, our waterways are not polluted anymore. Currently in 2021, no Northern Irish rivers had good overall status, that, you know, we have moved to a point where, you know, we're moving away from the usage of chemicals, where we are moving away from fossil fuels, where we are moving away from unsustainable practices, and instead, you know, this is a future that I think benefits people, you know, and is a future worth fighting for, and is a future that's very different to now, but it is still achievable, and as I said earlier, it's definitely worth fighting for.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more. Scott?
Yeah, it's always hard to pin down exactly, but it looked like some key things for me are, in terms of the process of getting there. I think formalised climate change education system in Northern Ireland is vital. We are not looking at it fast enough, we're not digging into it, and enabling change around climate change. It's been dealt with like any other issue that needs to be integrated, whereas actually this needs to be at the top of the list, and we need to move fast, and we need to move in a way that we haven't moved before, and integrating it into education systems in a much more formal way. So that would take us there. Some bigger changes that would create a different future for me are decoupling, you know, having spoken and worked on this as groups of people, of communities, we begin to decouple happiness from having more stuff. You know, and we stop thinking that I'll be satisfied and my family will be better and I will achieve stuff in life if I just have more stuff, because it is the root of so many ills, isn't it, for all of us, emotionally, socially and economically. And whilst that doesn't mean the collapse of everything, it moves towards this idea of sustainability, of taking as much as we need. And mixed with that, going back to a recognition that we don't stand over nature with the right to take from it what we choose to take from it. You know, we are part of it and we're dependent on it. So embedding that thinking of interdependence and of living with and within nature, I think is absolutely vital if we're going to move to some of the things that the coach has talked about. We need to change our thinking around, you know, a lot of traditional communities have a much more holistic view around nature and their part in it, rather than standing over it and taking what they need from it on and on and on. And I think that's absolutely vital. So education, that idea around consumption, which is always a challenge for us to change, and the satisfaction, how we find happiness in our lives, and being part of nature are key changes that I would like to see that enable a different future.
Well, I think that's been a really fascinating discussion, and I'd just like to say thanks to all three of the panellists, John Barry, Dakota Reid and Scott Howes. You've been very generous with your time, as has and the F.E. McWilliam's Gallery been extremely generous in hosting us, as has the Northern Ireland Museums Council in putting on this series of different events, all of which have been focusing on climate. So thanks to everyone. I hope it's been useful to you, the viewer, and I hope you can engage with us further on any of these issues. You know where to find us. And other than that, that's a wrap.